I was to say to you, love me 2 times, baby. Love me twice today. Love me 2 times. Sleep all night in your soul picture. Warm my mind in your chest stove. And must have whiskey or you know why. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Strand Theater. My name is David Finkel. On behalf of the Board of Directors and volunteers here at the Strand, we welcome you to our second Community Treasure Series since we restarted after a 2-year hiatus through COVID. And we're very pleased that you're here. Everybody who is online, thank you very much for attending. And if you have questions online, please give them in the comments and we'll be able to ask them at the end of the program. So last lecture we had last week, we had 279 people view it online. So we are getting some push and some traction with that, and we appreciate that. Before we get started, and Alex gets going on with all these big, tall words that he's going to use, we are going to talk about some upcoming things. It's a real hard thing to start this theater back up because normally we book a year in advance. And needless to say, we're cramming everything into a very short amount of time. But we do have, towards the end of the month, a schedule that's more like what we like, which is 5 things in a row. So on the 27th of April at 7 p.m., we will have our poetry night. April is National Poetry Month. We have done this for years with Three Sisters Books and Gifts. And it's going to be a great event. Bring your own poetry, come and listen to poetry, all sorts of things like that. That's free of charge at 7 p.m. The very next night on April 28th, that is the Thursday night, we have the Shelbyville High School Jazz Band doing their annual jazz concert. Again, we have not done this in 2 years. It's great. It's just a regular big band that's made up of students. They play all the repertoire you would expect from the 30s, 40s, all the way into some standards from today. And that'll be a lot of fun. That is free of charge, and I do believe that is at 7 o'clock as well. On the 29th, that is Friday, we are going to be hosting, starting our Doors weekend. So as we do tribute artists, we have decided to kind of expand it a little bit. We started this with Buddy Holly. We're extending it to the Doors, and that is that on Friday night, we're showing a movie about whatever group we're going to hear perform on Saturday night. So on Friday night, we're showing the 1991 Oliver Stone film, The Doors, and that starts at 7:30 p.m. And then the very next night, as you could see from the commercial on the screen, we have a great group from Cincinnati who does all the music from The Doors, and they will be performing at 7:30 on Saturday night. Tickets are available online on our website, or you can get them locally at Shelbyville Paint and Wallpaper. And that's going to be a lot of fun. And then since it's going to be such a fun weekend, the very next day on Sunday at 2:30 p.m., the Rush County Chorale is going to come sing a concert. Starts at 2:30 in the afternoon. It's a matinee. It's free of charge. And it will sound great. They've never performed for us before. They're a very fine singing ensemble. And certainly with our natural acoustics, they will sound just fantastic. So anyway, that's a few things that are coming up with the Strand. Please follow us on Facebook, like us on Instagram and Twitter. If you don't get our weekly email, certainly sign up for that. It goes out every Friday. This Friday, we will have a lot of memories from when Gilbert Gottfried, who just passed away yesterday, performed on our stage. There were several of us that hung with him all weekend. That was a trip in itself. And for anyone who was in the audience at the time, his brand of comedy was certainly something that I don't think Shelbyville was quite ready for. But everybody says it's one of the best shows we've ever done. And we certainly had a lot of fun, and we're sad that he passed away. So those go out. Just let us know. Send us an email, Facebook message, whatever. Or just holler at me, and we'll be happy to do it. Anyway, we are here for the Community Treasure Series, Conversations in Local History. This year, we have 6 programs as we get started back from COVID. This is number 2. And this month's topic is Building Shelby County. And here to present for us on behalf of the Grover Center, their executive director, Alex Krach. Thanks for coming to the Strand.
Thank you, David. All right, so I'm going to throw a bunch of disclaimers out right at the beginning here. So for today's discussion, all right, I think it's important to realize that I'm going to be covering about 14,000 years of history. That's approximately, real quick math that I already did ahead of time, 122 million hours of history. That's a lot of development to go over. I have about not even an hour to go over all of that. So some things are going to be left on the cutting room floor. That's not to say that they're not important things, and I am going to definitely give enough time at the end for you all to tell me what you think is important in the concept of building Shelby County. The focus of this discussion is, like I said, about building Shelby County, and we start well before Shelby County was even a thought. It's a snapshot of our upcoming display, building Shelby County from Wisconsin glaciation to today. This will launch in July, August. Before we go any further, I think it's important to take some time. This is the bicentennial for Shelbyville, right? And as such, I want to talk a little bit about this concept called liminality, all right? So liminality is going to be sort of central to this talk and then the next talk that I give about Public Square next month. Liminality is this concept that we as humans, we move from one stage to the next, right? And there is this in-between stage that exists, a transitional threshold. And so as we move from this one stage to the next, we are not what we once were, but we are not yet what we're becoming. And in history, that transitional threshold is the present. And what the future holds, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. We don't know about that. But we don't study history to necessarily know what the future holds. We study history to understand possibilities, to understand and widen our horizons. And we do that by looking at our past, the previous stage or stages. While studying the past doesn't help us predict the future, it does help us understand how we got here. Nothing was absolute in history. Nothing was inevitable. For every moment that went a certain direction, there was a web of possibilities. For example, what would have Shelbyville looked like had the courthouse not left Public Square? I mean, yes, we would have known that it would have looked like there was a courthouse in the middle of Public Square, but what would have Shelbyville been? Or what would have happened had Charles Davis not cared to extend his life any further past sweeping up the shavings of the wood on the Conroy Byerly Table Company? Or another one, what if the Clark automobile had succeeded in breaking the strangling hold that the furniture companies had on our community all those years ago? What then would have Shelby County been? So as we celebrate this bicentennial, or examine, as in why you're here tonight, the 14,000 years, we should also reflect on how out of all of those possibilities, we ended up here. So, all of those little things out of the way, let's get into the talk. Let's go back. Our journey tonight begins with the Ice Age, which will serve as our foundation, right? You can't really build something unless you have a foundation. You can build something if you don't need it to stand long without a foundation, but we're talking about something that's been here for quite a long time, so we definitely need a foundation. Technically, we are still in an ice age today, right? We're in a period called interglacial. That's between two glaciers. Well, maybe a glacier, like interglacial. All right, so what I'm focusing on tonight is the Wisconsin glaciation. Indiana was affected by 3 different glaciations. The first, we really don't know all that much about. The second basically covered the entirety of the state, save like a small little central portion of southern Indiana. And the third, the Wisconsin glaciation, is the one that really had the most prominent effect, I guess, on not just Indiana, but on Shelby County specifically. It covered the top 2/3 of the state, and it ended right before the southern portion of Shelby County. So if you're ever driving through Shelby County or going south, you'll see that our county goes from this very flat sort of land, right? And then all of a sudden it starts turning really hilly. And that's because the glacier didn't push down that far. In some places, this glacier was nearly 2 miles tall. The tallest building in Shelbyville is the Methodist building on Public Square. And it would require about 114 to 140 Methodist buildings stacked on top of each other to equal the height of this glacier. So I was told I'm allowed to walk around. David said I could. So if you look, Methodist building, this says not to scale, so don't think that this is supposed to be 100% accurate. But this is the Methodist building, and this is our glacier, right? We'll be using the Methodist building in a couple of different other places to talk about height here. So right now it would be fair to think, that's great, Alex. How does a glacier, though, that is no longer around have an impact on our day-to-day in Shelby County? How does something that retreated 14,000 years ago impact everything from Native American and early settlers to modern business and agriculture? Well, it starts with land. As I said, as the glacier moved south from Canada over the course of thousands of years, it ground up rocks. It flattened much of the land. As it retreated, it left in its wake glacier till, which is incredibly rich soil. It carved out lakes, it helped carve out rivers, and it left behind gravel, minerals, and rocks from Canada and Michigan. And over the course of thousands of years, that soil would serve as the base of everything to come. Around 12,000 years ago, the Paleo-Indians, the first people in America, arrived in Indiana. But how did they get here? Well, it also goes back to land, okay? As water levels dropped, a bridge formed between, a dry land bridge formed between Asia and Alaska, or what would become Alaska, and they crossed over. These early people were nomadic. They traveled from one place to the next in search of food, and their search for food led to what was probably North America's first invention, the Clovis Point, which is a spear head that allowed them to hunt mastodons and woolly mammoths and other megafauna, big animals. Like, think of the miniature versions we see today, except much larger. In fact, the first toolkit for building Shelby County, though we don't really have any Paleo-Indian presence here, are largely hunting tools. Other than the point, they also used blades for butchering animals and scrapers for cleaning and preparing hides. As the climate warmed, the environment changed, and large animals like the mammoth and the mastodon went extinct, which meant people needed to adapt because the earth was changing. The rich soil that the glacier till had left behind, coupled with flatlands, had major effects on the area that would become Shelby County. First, it made it possible for dense forests to grow. Keep in mind, when settlers arrived here, those trees were nearly 30 feet in circumference, and some were 200 feet tall, which, going back to the Methodist building, would require 2 Methodist buildings stacked on top of each other, and it still wouldn't quite reach the height of the 200-foot poplar trees, okay? Smaller animals like deer, bear, and elk thrived during this time and in these forested areas. To hunt and track these animals, the early people would set up small temporary campsites using hide, leaves, or bark. It really depended on where they were setting up their shelter. And they would travel from one area to the next. While hunting was still a central part of sustenance and points were made of stone, they were refined, would continue to be refined over thousands of years. So what you see here is the atlatl. I struggle with saying atlatl, but here we are. This is one of the inventions. This predates the bow and arrow, and you can see sort of how they would have used this. Rather than just using their own muscle power with the spear and hucking it there, you can see there's this attachment that is gripped on the end, and it kind of feeds into the back end of the spear and allows additional leverage to create speed, and it became a really highly volatile type of weapon. So this is the atlatl, and it was one of the best inventions that they had for thousands of years. Now, around 3,000 years ago, big changes happened. Indiana Native Americans began domesticating plants, like maize and goosefoot, which is sort of like quinoa. As a result, settlements began to spring up because people needed to stay near their crops and care for them. And as more areas were converted to farmland, it made little sense to pick up and move to a new land. Because of the dense forest and flatland, however, the area that would become Shelby County was incredibly swampy. And for much of Shelby County's early prehistoric period, it was largely hunting grounds. To supplement the settled lifestyle, elaborate trading routes were developed, which not only allowed people to gain access to resources not found in their area, but also allowed them to form new bonds with groups further away. Now, this is a really long period of time, and I'm very much painting in broad strokes tonight, all right? So to go into each period, you have the Paleo-Indians, and then you have the Archaic, which is split into 3 different eras with very unique cultures to each of those eras. You have early Archaic, Middle Late Archaic, and Late Archaic. You have woodland, which is then early woodland, middle woodland, middle late woodland, late woodland. And so to go into each of those specific cultures would take up way more time than I have, so I'm going to be fast forwarding a little bit. Everything that I just talked about there was the course of the thousands of years. They refined tools over time. So we're going to get to the early settlers now, but I want to reiterate that all the things I just mentioned, the creation of tools, farming, the construction of homes and settlements, and trading routes, these all grew in complexity and detail throughout that prehistoric period. Skills were passed from one generation to the next, and tools were refined over time. Now, one of the first white men to set foot into Shelby County was Jacob Wetzel, who blazed his trace with an axe from Brookville. I had one of my board members tell me, or former board members tell me, they're like, that's not right. I was like, I'm just reading from Chadwick's, man. I should double check my facts, right? Brookville to the bluffs of the White River. The road, which came to be known as Wetzel Trace, cut through what would become known as Shelby County and served the earliest pioneers as the main artery into the county. According to one early settler who was recorded in the historian and author Edward Chadwick's 1909 book, The History of Shelby County, he said this: "Without money and without the assistance which money brings, they had come here to make war upon nature in one of the most forbidding forms. Where now we see broad fields and wide pastures of open woodland, then the thickly standing oak, the poplar, the beech, the maple, and the ash stood closely intertwining their limbs. When clothed in their summer verdure, a shade so deep and dark was produced to shut out the sun from May to October. From the damp earth below sprang a growth of underbrush, so dense that it presented in many places an impenetrable barrier to the horseman, and in some instances almost inaccessible to the footman. In connection with this, let it be borne in the mind that the level lands, which occupy such a large space in Shelby County, were at that time inundated with water more than half the year. The forests, which checkered over the trunks of trees, some newly fallen, some sunk half their diameter in oozy soil, and these laying in every direction closed the drains until there was scarcely any escape for the flood, save by the slow process of evaporation and percolation. The soil, rich as it was and is in organic matter, chemically mixing with the watery element, rendered the paths and woods almost untraversable for man or beast. There were no great roads upon which to travel. There were no markets in which to buy or sell. There were no broad fields in which to raise grain for bread. Under these circumstances, unpropitious as they were, the pioneer settlers were compelled to maintain themselves and families. We may well imagine that it was in many instances a very hard struggle for life." So, I mean, not a great pitch for coming and living in Shelby County, you know. Don't know that tourism would be using that as their slogan. But it gives you an idea of what Shelby County looked like. And this is a picture of Meltzer Woods. It's kind of the closest glimpse that we can get of what Shelby County would have been when people were coming here. Maybe not quite as swampy, but the old growth forests give an idea of how impenetrable those forests really were. Now, while hardly a road, when Wetzel's Trace was developed, it did make it easier for settlers to arrive in this area. The first to use the trace was James Wilson, the county's first settler. He settles in Little Marion. Like most pioneers, one of the first things he and his sons did was construct a cabin. It was 16 foot square. Now, this was smaller than most first cabins that settlers would build. Most were 18 by 20 feet. His decision most likely was influenced by the idea of settling in the dead of winter. It was much easier to heat a smaller space and still have enough room for the entirety of his family. Additionally, as soon as pioneers settled in an area, they made quick work of establishing roads to many other of the early settlements. And Shelby County, a road from Shelbyville to Little Marion, was established between April and November of 1822. As not every early settler was a farmer, some were blacksmiths, carpenters, and milliners. Pioneer settlements and roads connecting isolated houses to these settlements allowed early trade to flourish, much like the elaborate trade routes established by the Native Americans before. One thing that you'll find in any built area is the impact that routes, roads, and railways have on the development of agriculture and industry. Shelby County was an early adopter of the railway. Judge William Peaslee was an East Coaster who would have witnessed the positive impact that the railway had on communities on the East Coast when it was first introduced. In 1834, Judge William Peaslee began working with community leaders to develop an experimental railroad. I always get frustrated about how Judge Peasley's kind of addressed, certainly when I first started working at the museum and hearing different people talk about Judge Peaslee, it was always like with this that guy, it's like a joke, right? And undeserved, and I think it's even compounded in the history books because they called him the crazy Yankee. Not a great appellation to have, certainly, right? And the thing is when they talk about his railroad, they say things like, oh, but it wasn't an engine. It was a horse and carriage on 2 oak beams. It's not even a railway. But that's only the surface explanation. Yeah, it was a horse-drawn carriage, and yes, it was on 2 oak beams, but it fails to recognize why it was created. Did you know that it was a 2-mile track that was purposely built over 2 ravines, right? That a single horse was selected to highlight what kind of power or it was needed or was not needed to make that kind of journey, or that the land grade measurements were taken the entirety of that 2 miles, and then that information was all compiled into a report and turned over to one of the first railroad companies in Indiana. So it wasn't a crazy idea. Judge Peaslee, what he was doing was he was gathering information. He was doing some footwork for the engineers. He was making a pretty strong case on why you might want to come through Shelby County because, look, we already did all the work for you. All you have to do is ship down the old railroad and we'll be good to go. Unfortunately, the actual railroad would take 20, 25 years to materialize in Shelby County. So it was the 1850s that it finally was ushered in, and this brought with it a new period. Prior to this moment, most early settlers were solely focused on supplying the needs and the wants of their families, right? We need you to have clothing, and we need you to be fed, and we need you to have a house. You're not getting the Game Boy. It's not happening, right? That's just not in the cards. So, like the trade routes that were established thousands of years before, materials and finished products could be now shipped outside of the community and to the community. The first true manufacturing plant arrived around the same time that the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and St. Louis was finished in 1853. It was built by Joseph R. Stewart, and he developed a wood planing mill. This is one of the first of its kind, and it sort of establishes Shelby County as a lumber industry, in the lumber industry, and eventually the furniture industry. While many other industries were established after the Stewart planing mill, it was the Conroy, Waller, and Depry Company that ushered in the new era of Shelby County, the era of the furniture industry. And this is just one of the many furniture companies. We already gave a talk on furniture, and it could have been 6 hours and not just 1 hour, so we're not going to go into all the furniture companies again tonight. A little bit more about Conroy, Waller, and Depry. It was started in, like I said, in the 1870s, and eventually in '76 it was able to purchase the Stewart planing mill, and with its new size and increased production that allowed them to begin shipping furniture out to other communities. This was the first step in Shelbyville establishing itself as Little Grand Rapids, and we'll get to that in a second. Unfortunately, so I guess I will just get to it now. Little Grand Rapids was one of the top furniture producers in the United States. Shelbyville was second to Grand Rapids, but that came with a host of issues. We had tons of furniture companies here. We had, at its height, it's between 20 and 30 different companies. And in 1909, the Industrial Club was founded here in Shelbyville and tasked with raising funds to attract industry to Shelbyville. As there were already 12 companies in 1909 that were the furniture industry, we can make a safe bet that their goal was to offer a different employer for the community members. Just a few years before, many of the furniture factory owners were found to have been paying local newspaper editors to publish content that would dissuade workers from unionizing. This was really kind of made public by, I think it was the Shelbyville Democrat, and it laid bare sort of all of the sins of, a lot of the blame was put on the newspapers, but obviously the furniture manufacturers had a big role to play in that. Many in the town shared this belief that the furniture manufacturers did not want other industries to develop locally so that they could better control the labor market. The Industrial Club hoped to help the situation, and in 1909, the Clark Automobile Company was offered a site on South Miller Street, just off the lateral switch of the railroad. Ultimately, for many reasons, not just the pressures that the furniture companies had brought, the Clark Automobile Company did not last in Shelbyville. However, and I asked this former board member too, if I'm saying this right, so don't yell at me. I'm going to try it. Is it Mont Glove? It's Mont Glove. Mont Glove? We're good with that? Mont or Monty? I don't know. He said say it either way and we'll say it with confidence. Monty Glove Factory, which was started in 1909 with the help of the Industrial Club. It did survive, and not only did it survive, it thrived. Ironically, that company was established in the headquarters of the old Connery Waller and Depry complex. It closed in 1973, outliving nearly every furniture company that would have liked to see it never open its doors. Another company that grew out of the remains of the Connery Waller and Depry company was the Chambers Company in Shelbyville, which started in the old furniture company storerooms. Eventually, as the business grew, they took over the old Clark Automobile Company that I just talked about. Some of the furniture companies, like some of the furniture companies, Chambers became a national brand. After World War II, the company was sold, and it ceased locally here in 1955. Now, up to this point, we've been focusing a lot on the industrial side of things. And that's largely because up to this point, agriculture hadn't undergone significant changes. I mean, technology had changed slightly from the early 1800s up to the end there, but like industry, that ball was moved drastically forward with the coming of the train. Mills were first introduced in Shelby County, and they were the first in 1822, which makes sense. They were one of the first industries. They were one of the first needs of the community. Chadwick notes that, quote, "Without question, the most important calling found among men has ever been, is now, and will ever be the tilling of the soil and the production of such things as the race must of necessity subsist on, food and clothing. In almost every other section of the county, the farm has been originally, at least, the base of all other industries." The first mill in Shelby County was the Walker Mill, which was located near where the Porter Center is now. Walker's Mill wasn't just where the grain was milled. In the early years, a squirrel infestation nearly wiped Shelbyville off the map, depleting the settlers' food storage and ravaging their crops. I should say that Shelbyville wasn't unique in this. It also affected Indianapolis as well. Had John Walker not provided the grain, the stored grain for the settlers to make it through the winter and plant in the spring, who knows, once again, at what Shelbyville would have been today. Early settlers would travel miles to have their crops milled. It was dangerous, with one historian noting, quote, "It was perhaps a 2 or 3 days' journey. Sometimes a pair of oxen attached to a 2-wheel cart carried the farmer and his grain on his journey, but frequently he went on horseback, seated on a bag of grain. This was a tedious journey, and his return was anxiously awaited by mother and children. There are some recollections of going to a mill that bring them pictures of weary, watchful nights when father did not return as promised and expected, being delayed by the number of grits before him or the impassable conditions of the roads or traces. Those were dismal phases of pioneer life, when the darkness closed in upon the anxious mother and crying children, when the winds beat upon the rude cabin, bringing to the ears unwelcome sounds, laden with the howls of starving wolves, when hunger pressed heavily upon the helpless inmates. Over the decades, traveling to the mill became less and less dangerous. New stores meant that community members needn't plant their own crops or have them milled. Still, mills at the turn of the century were a big industry in Shelby County. In 1887, Fred Kennedy joined his father at G.W. Kennedy Milling and Grain Company, which was also known as Star Mill. During this time working at the mill, he saw how much grain was lost when shipped on a freight car. To help cut the loss, he developed a paper car liner that stopped grain from pouring through the cracks during transportation. In 1911, he opened Kennedy Car Liner, and farmers could now ship their crops farther away without having to factor in significant loss. In 1916, the company also began producing bags. This would lead Stan Bogue, a package designer for KCL, in 1957 to develop plastic utility bags. If you've ever been to a produce section of the grocery store, getting some produce, you've seen Mr. Bogue's bags in action, a perforated edge that you could then seal off. Also, he talks about how that patent in this one article wasn't significant enough to keep other people from stealing his design. He said weekend bag makers could turn out the content and do it at far cheaper than KCL could, simply because they didn't have the overhead. Ultimately, we see them everywhere now. In 1905, another industry that served the agriculture end of things was introduced, the canning industry. Now that we get all of our food either fresh or frozen, we have that capability now, which are, by the way, two areas that hastened the end of the canning industry. We don't think much about how much of an impact this had on the community up until the 1960s when they kind of closed out. The first and largest of these canning factories was the Shelbyville Canning Company, Inc., and it was started by a guy named Grafton Johnson. At its peak, it employed more than 600 people during peak canning season. The company, along with 4 other state holdings, were reorganized in 1916 as Fame Canning Company. A fire ultimately ended its operation in 1928, but its arrival opened the door for other canning industries. In fact, most of these factories were first-time financed by local businesses, like business persons, and were located near towns in the county, which added to the economy for both canning industry and the farmer growers they contracted in those areas. Other canning factories included E.G. Reese Canning Company in Waldron, the Blue River Packing Company in Morristown, the Flat Rock Canning Company, the Gwinneville Canning Company, the Fairland Canning Company, the St. Paul Canning Company, and the Morristown Canning Company, which was started by the former superintendent of the first canning company, Fame. The company was the last remaining plant in Shelby County, finally closing in 1968. During the 1930s, a lot of change happened in Shelby County. Because of the Depression, a lot of the furniture factories closed. Many factories stood idle. World War II brought some of those factories back to life. One company that was able to bridge the gap between industry and agriculture was the National Farm Machine Company, which came to town in 1940. It took up shop in the old Conroy Byerly Company factory, and its business landed a defense contract at the end of 1941. It remained in town for about 10 years. And we'll see here, actually, could we skip to the next slide real quick? I think this is right. Yeah, so you've already seen this image, but home to many more companies, and it really was, starting with this one. It quickly changes hands over time, so just want you guys to have that one in your sight here. Now, I've not created an exhaustive list for this time period for a couple of reasons. One, some of the companies that might have been a good fit here are like Admiral, right? They made televisions and radios starting in 1947. They're already represented in other exhibits at Grover Center. And like I said, this exhibit is built in Shelby County, so it's exclusive to that area. Others, while significant, didn't necessarily provide like those watershed moments, those big, massive changes. One company that did signify a massive change, its arrival was significant, was the General Electric Industrial Heating Department. They arrived in 1955 and were located east of Shelbyville. This highlights Shelby County's push into the technological side of things. Now, the vacuum left by the absence of the furniture factories was quickly filled at the end of the 1940s and 1950s. Before other industries had to fight for their spot in the community. Now that the old guard was gone, the doors were open. The furniture factories that had kept all of those industries out now house these newer industries in their remains. National Farm Machinery, which had taken up residence in the old Conroy Byerly complex, was replaced by first Pittsburgh Plate Glass. So Pittsburgh Plate Glass was located there. Then Certainteed, and finally by Knauf, a German-based company, in 1978. That building ultimately burns down. We talked about that in, I think it was the first Community Treasure series about the fire. The sister city relationship between Shizuoka, Japan, and Shelbyville, which was developed in the 1980s and was helped along by Ryobi, further moved Shelby County into the global market on the industry side of things. 13 Japanese companies now have a presence in Shelby County. Most manufacturers, however, are no longer locally owned. Agriculture also became globalized, and vast technological improvements changed it greatly. Earl Butz, a former dean of agriculture at Purdue University, noted in his writings on Indiana's sesquicentennial, quote, "American agriculture has entered the age of science and technology. Brainpower has replaced horsepower as the central ingredient of success on our farm." Poet, a biofuel manufacturer that uses corn to produce ethanol, highlights this shift in agriculture. As Shelby County just finished its bicentennial last year, and Shelbyville is in the middle of celebrating its bicentennial this year, I'd like to end on a couple more passages from the Indiana sesquicentennial book, Indiana, A Self-Appraisal. The first is from Earl Butz again. He says, "Large numbers of urban workers, many of them from former farm families, will live in the country. There are very few rural families in Indiana who do not live within commuting distance of urban employment. As these urban-oriented families intermingle with farm families in church, school, 4-H clubs, and social occasions, a new culture will emerge, which will combine the best of our present rural and urban cultures. This may be called the new rurban culture." I practiced that like 5 times, and I'm still not sure that that's how he wanted that said. Rurban culture. He continues, "Organized and imaginative research is the vehicle which will push the scientific frontier beyond limits we scarcely dare to dream today. If we can keep our economy free and preserve an environment in which individual scientists are free to dream a little about new techniques and new ideas, and to enjoy the fruits of their dreams, we shall experience phenomenal progress in the next generation." And from the same book, John Mee, who is the dean of the Division of General and Technical Studies at Indiana University, wrote about industry in Indiana. He begins by listing a few of the developments that were significant and firsts for Indiana. And he then goes on to state, "From the time that Indiana entered the Union on December 11th, 1816 as the 19th state, there has been a continuous growth in manufacturing activities. Dominance in manufacturing was not achieved easily or quickly, however. Hoosier perseverance and leadership were essential through several stages of growth and development." He concludes his essay with, "A self-appraisal of Indiana manufacturing during the past 150 years leads to the conclusion that Hoosiers have made a magnificent transition from the agricultural to an industrial economy. For the future, the principal uncertainty lies in whether or not Hoosier leadership and private enterprise, both worker and management, public administration, education, and religion can cope with a gradual transition to a scientific and technological economy." So, with all that being said, like I said, 14,000 years and 40 minutes in, so I want to turn it to you. Like I said, this wasn't all-encompassing. Obviously, I didn't go over, we could have spent some time talking about stay tight, or, well, I mean, I'm not going to do the work for you. What kind of places do you think made a significant impact in our industry or in our agriculture that I didn't bring up tonight? And I can just take you guys the mic, or, oh, nope. Cody's got you. Anybody? No? Seeing Pat there does remind me, I didn't even bring up that KCL also expands itself past just Indiana, right? It becomes it becomes a national brand, and then it becomes an international brand when it travels to Canada. So another big milestone in our industry here.
Any other questions?
Alex, you were opening this up. What was your question? What did you say?
What was my question? Yeah, so,
What did you want to say?
yeah, any industry or agriculture, like
Okay.
important kind of industry or agriculture that I didn't bring up tonight that you think is significant into the idea of building Shelby County.
This doesn't quite fit, but I think we need to say something or recognize our rivers, right? Those waterways that are significant
Sure.
and still are, because we've actually now added a trail to them, and
Yeah.
so I think
Yeah, and kind of folding that in, if we jump back to the pioneer movement, first, people are we're water-centric, right? So this goes from the Native Americans, a lot of development that we see with Native American groups, especially in that prehistoric period, are happening along waterways, which, again, were provided to us by the glacier. And then also, people tend to move, early settlers like the pioneers would move towards the rivers because it offered another means of travel, and it offered power for their grist mills, their wood mills, whatever it might be. Yeah, so rivers have always been a central part of the human story.
You bet. Yeah, Alex, you're mentioning anything we're missing, and one of the things comes to my mind is bringing the agricultural improvements or innovations forward past whenever you left it off. I'm thinking about the cooperative effort, right? The Shelby County Co-op specifically, and as you're speaking about agriculture, one of the images that I use from our collection in class that mirrors the national narrative of that cooperative nature on the farm is this picture of, excuse me, sorry. I'm trying not to spit in your mic, sorry. Is a picture of a team of 18 horses drawing, whatever the farm implement is, and obviously this individual farmer doesn't have these 18 horses. They're relying on a cooperative nature of many farmers working together, helping each other out to do what they need to do in their fields. And then the next image I show the kids also from our collection is the incorporation of the shift from horsepower to a different kind of horsepower, this huge monstrosity of the McCormick's Reaper out on the field in northwest Shelby County. So this is me rambling maybe, but the cooperative nature of the efforts to the farmers, right?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And actually, I just talked to not just the cooperative nature of the farmers, which is shared cropping and things like that is obviously something that's even happening today. But one of the things that I was just talking to a farmer, and I shared that quote about that we're trading horsepower or manpower for what was it, horsepower or something like that, brain power, manpower for brain power, and I was talking to this farmer, and what she told me was, yeah, absolutely. First of all, she said my grandfather began farming in the early 1900s, and he had a horse that he did all the farming on the land that we're still farming today, and that shifted over time to a tractor, and now they plug in the coordinates into their computer and on the tractor itself, and it runs lines by itself. It does the work. It kind of follows like a Google Maps, I guess, of crops. And they also have introduced, and Scott can talk over at Purdue, can talk a little bit more to this because I don't necessarily understand it. But the introduction with technology using drones, right? And they can map fields, and they can predict what a field will look like based off of what's going on in this area, or how is water lying in this area, or are they going to have less seed developing here because of XYZ, because of whatever environmental, and they can do this all now, and it simply wouldn't have even existed at the Sesquicentennial. So technology, but it is cool to know that through all of that, there is that human element, again, that we still come together. I mean, the grist mill, we go back to John Walker again, right? That people are cooperating then, and that's become a part of that narrative, I guess, through time.
I just have a question for you on this, and you might have some background on it. When you go up 9 and you see the sign there for Wenzel's Trace, and they describe how that was almost unpassable, and that he cut all that through there. First question that comes to mind is, do they know how long it took him and his small group to cut that trail through from basically Franklin County all the way past Indianapolis?
Roundabouts. So 1818 is when it starts, early 1818, and it's finished by mid 1818. So not Not as long as you would expect, but yeah, just under a year.
Well, and the other part that's hard to imagine is when you go up there and you see all the open fields that are all farmland. Was there improvements or different types of machines or something that came in to help for the clearing away of trees and I'm assuming the stumps because you can't you can't farm with a stump in there, or was that still all primarily just with axe and saw and brute strength and horses and stuff to clear all that?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So I guess my best way to answer that is it would depend on what time period we're talking about, right? So in 1822 up until, we'll say, the mid-1800s, right, it's manpower. That's how they're clearing that out. And they're doing it on condition of, it's a gradual type of thing, So as they start pushing past the needs of their family, maybe they need a little bit more crops to bring to market, then they are taking and clearing land and making that into farmland then. Like I said, with the advent of the railroad, they could then start shipping past just our small community, and this has an impact. And so more and more are cleared off, but also the furniture industry taking off in the 1870s also has an impact to this. We have resource to use right away. And so that definitely expedites the clearing of the forests in this area. I don't know that necessarily answered your question if it was all manpower. Eventually, yeah, it's going to be more, there's going to be tools and machines that are developed. One of my favorite stories is, and this is more recent, this is like in the 1980s, J.G. Depper used to sell dynamite, right? Like you could go and ask for some dynamite in there. And one gentleman had told me that he had went there and picked up some, and he had about a row of stumps that he needed to blast sky high, and he did. And so dynamite also was a pretty good resource to removing some stumps that might have been in your way. Now back to the Wetzel's Trace, the impassable, they wouldn't necessarily be removing the stumps. Often what they would do, and this was true to the Michigan Road as well, is that they would level off, they would round the stumps so that wagons could make it over top of them. Michigan Road began with a strict stipulation that it had to be a certain amount cut and rounded, and then found that with the breadth of the project that would be much too difficult, and so they shortened how much, or they lengthened, I guess. They said they could be higher, and just as long as it was round. So when they say it's impassable, it was passable enough, but it doesn't last long. By the mid-1820s, the trace is not really being used anymore.
So as we sit here, let's think back to 1895, okay? And in 1895, where we are sitting here in the audience, what would we be surrounded by at this very spot? Does anyone know? No, right here where we're sitting, we would be surrounded by dead bodies because this was a funeral parlor. Where Alex is, which is a separate building, what would he be surrounded by? Horses, because that was a livery stable. So even as we sit here in the Strand, we have a lot of things that change, and 1895 wasn't all that long ago. Some of us remember it very well, but it's amazing how things go. Cody, do we have any questions online? Nope, no questions online. Oh, here you go, Mary.
How about hospitals? Did we just have Major Hospital?
Yeah.
And when is that the only one Shelbyville's had?
That's a great question, and yeah, I'll answer to that. I was trying to form my thoughts here, gather them up. One of the first doctors in the community is going to be Dr. McFadden, William McFadden, and he, at this time in the 1800s, largely what you're doing is you have a will call type of doctor. They show up to your house. In the end of the 1800s, there is for lack of a better way of putting it, I guess a city hospital that forms where Sandman's is at, the lots to the wait, it's actually further down. Past Sandman's lots there was a small little house that was also a infirmary type of thing. Not really a hospital. Major was, when William Major makes his donation of his mansion, it's the first hospital in Shelby County. There is Horde Sanitarium, and the building is still standing. Not well loved in the medical journals of that time period. So he, claims that Dr. Horde claims that he can cure various type of afflictions and addictions, and most of the medical journals, even then, have some pretty strong things to say about Dr. Horde and his practice. So not maybe medically backed as much as like snake oil backed. Yeah, you definitely didn't. I mean, a doctor wasn't necessarily like the guy that you wanted to see. Like things have progressed to a point where, yeah, yep, yeah. One of the things I like always like bring up, especially when we're talking about our military collection, is we have this anesthesia mask in the basement for the Civil War, and the chemical was so potent that, because the option was if you got shot, it wasn't like, oh, we'll try to dig it out. It was just like, okay, you're going to lose an arm. So they would give this anesthesia, and it was so potent, it was so powerful that the chemical would mix with like the metal sometimes, and it would leave these burn marks on the patient's face. So yeah, I mean, you definitely didn't want to be running with a guy that was practicing medicine in the mid-1800s.
So Alex, can you tell us about the May Community Treasure Series and what we can expect for that?
Yeah, so we're going to be revisiting Public Square, right? So we did this talk before, but with its launch, I think it's important that we kind of focus in on it again. And also, we also launched a display in the interim, and plug, it's still up if you guys want to see it. That'll give us an opportunity to sort of talk about what values our community holds at any given period. So it's basically looking at that display and bringing it to life through discussion.
And that will be on Wednesday, May 11th, right here, same time, same place. Also, we will do that online as well. We want to thank Alex at the Grover Center for a fantastic program. How about a round of applause? Thank you to our online audience for joining us. And it's a good thing that I asked Alex, are you going to go walking around the stage or stay where he is? He said, no, I'm not going to move. And I told Cody, maybe I better put lights across the stage in case he walks. Well, it's a good thing we did that. So anyway, thank you for coming to the Strand. Thank you for supporting all of our organizations in town. We have a lot of fun exploring where we came from, and you're sitting at ground zero for where we're going. Thank you very much.
You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a lie if I was to say to you, love me 2 times, baby, love me twice today.